Hi everyone, welcome to this talk called Nutrition for Strength Athletes. I'm very excited about this talk because it's going to entail very useful information on how to optimize strength performance and also recovery and adaptations from strength training. Now, before I start, by giving a quick overview about the research that we currently have available for actually strength athletes and nutritional recommendations. There is an overlap between similar types of, I would say, exercise and training that are being assessed in terms of nutrition. So we're having studies done on people that are bodybuilders. Then we have studies done on people that are powerlifters. And then we have studies done on people that might just be regular university students that enroll in such studies, or just a regular fitness enthusiast. So there is no 100% clear research for strength athletes, because we'd have to determine first what actually is a strength athlete. In what repetition range does a strength athlete work? These are questions that science hasn't really distilled and narrowed down so far, because it would be a very narrow range and a very specific topic to be assessed. So we're gathering information here from, I would say, professions or types of training that all entail strength training to a degree, more or less. Now, to give an overview, we're going to be looking at total calories and strength training. We're going to be looking at protein, carbs, and fats as the three main macronutrients recommendations for strength athletes. And we're also going to look at micronutrients at the end. So that'll be all vitamins, mineral, trace elements. And we're going to touch on that briefly too. So let's start. Total calories for strength athletes. Now, the question is, if you want to maximize your strength and be as strong as possible, should you be eating in a caloric surplus, at maintenance, or is even a caloric deficit possible? So these are important factors that we have to include in our analysis, and therefore give the best recommendations that we can to anyone who is out to optimize their strength performance. Now, we have a study here by Murphy and Köhler from this year. Energy deficiency impairs resistance training gains in lean mass, but not strength. A meta-analysis and meta-regression from the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports. Now, two factors were assessed in this study. First of all, let me explain. This is a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is kind of it's an analysis of multiple analyses. So it's giving like a bird's view of a specific topic that is research is trying to answer. And it's assessing different studies with similar subjects and interventions that were in studies that had been done. And the meta-analysis is kind of collecting these studies and giving a broad overview of what these studies resulted in. So the first element that was assessed was the relationship between a caloric deficit, which was around 500 calories, and lean body mass. Now, here is what they found. If we look at this graph, we're going to see a vertical line going through all but the middle of the picture. And to the left, you're going to have those studies that have a black square on each of the horizontal bars. Now, we're showing here with this study that basically all of them had favored the control group. As you can see on the bottom left, it says favors control. And on the right-hand side, on the bottom, it says favors energy deficit. Now, all of these studies were favoring not to be in a caloric deficit to optimize or to build lean body mass. All of them, all of the studies. So this tells us if we want to optimize lean body mass, if we want to build muscle, being in a caloric deficit is not recommended. Now, how does lean body mass relate to strength? Well, we know that our levels of lean body mass are one determining factor of maximizing strength. The more muscle mass we have, the greater our cross-sectional area, the greater the potential there is to produce force in a movement in any given time. For example, if you have a really big chest, like big chest muscles, you're going to have a relatively better bench press performance. Similar speaking, if you have a high amount of muscle mass in your quads, hamstrings, and glutes, you're going to perform better, relatively speaking, at squats and deadlifts. So lean body mass is important to optimize strength performance. And this meta-analysis showed that we need to be at maintenance, at least, or in a caloric surplus to optimize lean body mass. Now, the second question this study answered or tried to answer was assessing the relationship between a caloric deficit and strength gains. Now, if you look at the results here, you're going to see the vertical line through the middle again, and then you're having 4 studies to the left of that vertical bar and 5 studies to the right. So an all but 50-50 distribution. Now, one thing to explain here, you're going to see at the bottom of that picture, you're going to see numbers 0.5, 1.5, 2.5, and then going into the left direction, you're going to see minus 0.5, minus 1.5, minus 2.5, and minus 3.5. Now, what that means is the scope or the strength of the effect that the intervention had in each study. Now, if we take the vertical bar, the effect would have been 0, which means there was no effect of the intervention. If we look to the left now, you're going to see the black squares are a little bit further away of the vertical line than the black squares to the right of the vertical bar, because they're a little bit closer towards that 0 vertical line, which means that the scope of the strength of the effect was stronger in all interventions to the left of the vertical bar. And that means these were all the interventions that were not in a caloric deficit, which either worked at maintenance or in a caloric surplus. So what this means is, in a nutshell, if we look at it 50-50 roughly, divided between studies showing that you can be in a caloric deficit and build strength, as well as you can be in a caloric surplus or maintenance to build strength. So this would give us a clue that being in a caloric deficit is fine for building strength. However, the scope of the effect is probably going to be larger if we're not in a deficit. Now, if we look at these 2 results of this study together, the previous slide showed that not being in a deficit is recommendable to build lean body mass. And here we have a 50-50 or 60-40 distribution. Now, what this tells us is that in order to maximize strength gains, it's definitely better to be at least at maintenance calories or in a caloric surplus. There's also a few nuances we have to consider when analyzing this. Now, let's take a beginner. Yeah. So this is one of the nuances. A beginner, anything they pick up in terms of a weight, because they've never lifted a weight before, is going to make them stronger, whether they're in a deficit or not. So the starting position of the person is a really important consideration. For more intermediate or advanced lifters, the picture is going to be painted completely differently, because these kind of lifters already have a big training experience and they need the nutrients to feed their body and recover from training and to get small little increments of gains out of their training. So the starting position is really important. Number two, most studies here that were assessed in this study were done with a maximum of 5 months. Now, we don't know how this picture would have looked like if subjects would have been exposed to a caloric deficit for 6 months or even longer. I'm not even sure that's really feasible in the long term, because performance will drop at some point if we're in a caloric deficit for too long. This is a given, because after some time, the body needs more nutrients to reach new levels of adaptation. The third thing we have to consider here is lifestyle factors of the person. Now, if the person sleeps well, is a happy person, loves their job, has a great family life, has great sleep, eats really well, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, or almost not, then probably that person will find it easier to still build strength while being in a caloric deficit. If we take a person that is stressed, that doesn't sleep well, that lacks energy, I believe being in a caloric deficit is not going to help that person to build strength, because that person needs the nutrients to actually get to a higher strength level. So these are important considerations when looking at total calories for strength improvement. So let's look at the first macronutrient, protein. Now, there are two ways we can trigger a process in our body called mTOR. mTOR is the switch that turns on muscle protein synthesis, which basically is muscle building. This is a switch, this is a signal for our brain to receive and tell the body, okay, we're going to start building and repairing muscle now, because that person is really serious about their training. So we need to make sure we lay down extra material and we make the muscle fibers strong. Now, there's two ways to trigger mTOR: training and diet. We trigger mTOR with training, lifting weights, strength training. We destroy the muscle, it recovers and adapts. Through diet, mostly through protein intake to build muscle mass. Now, the study by Hartman et al. From 2006 showed that intense periods of resistance training improves net protein retention, hence less need for dietary protein intake. So what that basically means is, if you resistance train, if you strength train at least 3 times a week, you already have enough of a stimulus to trigger muscle protein synthesis. So actually your protein intake through diet is lower. On the other hand, if you don't strength train with that kind of consistency, then your dietary protein intake requirements are higher. So there's two ways how to trigger mTOR, training or diet. Depending on how much you use either of them, if you use it a lot from your diet, you could say then you have to strength train less, which is obviously not the goal, because we want to strength train. And if you really do that at least 3 times a week, you have a good stimulus already. So that means your protein intake is actually a little bit lower. Now, having a look at this Hartman study here, it says net protein retention. So there's two things we have in the body. One is protein breakdown, and one is protein building. And we have net protein balance in the middle. Okay? So when your breakdown is higher than your retention, then you have a negative net protein balance. When your retention is higher than your breakdown, then you have a positive protein balance. Okay, so it's always a balance between breakdown and retention. So let's look now, what is the amount that one needs for optimizing strength performance? Now, the literature suggests anything between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day. So if you weigh 100 pounds, that would be anything between 160 to 220 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. Now, let's look at the lower threshold, 1.6. This is the one you can use if you consistently do strength training. 2.2 grams is for more sedentary people, or the ones that don't have the opportunity to strength train that often, which I hope you actually do. And also for bodybuilders, because they expose their body to a lot of disruption and destruction in the muscular system all the time. And also because they have a higher, relatively speaking, and total amount of muscle mass, they can do with higher levels of protein per day. Somewhere in between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day is recommended. If you fall below that, will you still build muscle and get stronger? Of course you will. But as always in fitness, there's always a gray area. There's never a black and white thinking. Any further intake above 2.2 grams has not shown to have any extra or additional benefits. So there is a trade-off, yeah? And if you go above that, threshold, there's no point ingesting more protein because it will just be oxidized and not used for metabolic processes. Now, in terms of the frequency of protein intake, the protein breakdown may be lower with more frequent protein intake versus just a single bolus of intake per day. Now, that basically means distributing our protein portions throughout the day seems to have better effects of buffering protein breakdown. So in order to build muscle better and recover from strength training, really spread out your protein portions throughout the day. Moore et al., that study from 2009, suggests 5 to 6 times per day of 20-gram protein for maximum stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. Now, I'd say make this even easier. 3 times a day of your main meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, make sure you're getting in there at least 20 or 30 grams of protein. And whatever is left in between, you can see as gap fillers. So you've got main meals and gap fillers. That's probably the easiest way to remember it. Now, in terms of timing, the question often arises, do I need to eat protein really quickly after my workout, or can there be a time period in between? And also, is it better to ingest it before a training session, or what's the best timing of protein intake? Now, the muscle protein synthesis rates are greater when the protein is actually consumed in the post-training period. So I always say as close as you can to the cessation of your workout. However, a threshold leucine dose of 2.5 grams must be consumed to trigger mTOR efficiently. Now, leucine is the amino acid that triggers, or that is the key to switch on mTOR. Yeah, leucine, the amino acids. We also have valine and isoleucine, but leucine is the actual most important amino acid to trigger mTOR. Now, how do you get 2.5 grams of leucine? 30 grams of animal protein, that'd be like a big chicken breast, or around 35 grams of plant protein. So it could be a plant protein shake. So either one of the two you can choose to trigger mTOR. So in the post-training period, to trigger this mTOR process, a threshold dose of leucine must be consumed. You can also consider this and take that as important information for your breakfast and lunch. Say you train in the afternoon. You want to trigger mTOR evenly distributed throughout the day. So by consuming 2.5 grams of leucine for breakfast and also for lunch, you're keeping that mTOR, that muscle protein synthesis trigger, up throughout the day. There's one study by Moore et al. Which showed that 20-gram dose of egg protein stimulated muscle protein synthesis to a greater degree compared to 5 or 10 grams. And the plateau occurred at a larger dose of 40 grams. So 20 grams of protein seems to be a really, really good dose to consume with your meals, at least with your main meals. There's also one showing that 20 grams of whey were sufficient with no more added benefit of 40 grams. So 40 grams seems to be kind of unnecessary. However, after full body resistance training workout, 40 grams maximally stimulated muscle protein synthesis versus 20 grams of protein. So it seems that when we're in intense periods of training or intense days of training, say you do strength training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can actually look for 40 grams of protein after your workout because you've just done probably a full body resistance training workout. And on days where you don't train, you can spread it out a little bit more evenly with only 20 grams of protein per meal. So the question now, which type of protein or which source of protein is the best to stimulate mTOR, the muscle protein synthesis process? Now, it obviously depends, first of all, on your food preferences. But if we look at it theoretically, animal protein has a higher amount of leucine, and the amino acid leucine in it, and also valine and isoleucine. Now, animal protein in that sense is favorable to induce a better muscle protein synthesis process. However, obviously, if you don't eat animal products, then you're left with plant products. And in that category, pea protein, soy protein, and hemp protein, in that order, are those plants with the highest amount of valine, leucine, and isoleucine, so in their category. So you probably need a higher total amount of protein with plants compared to animal food. So for example, 20 grams of protein from an animal source would be roughly the equivalent of 35 grams of protein from a plant source. So overall, you have to intake a bit more from the plant kingdom, if that's your preferred option to eat. Now, do I have to be worried that when I'm vegan or vegetarian, that I won't build the same amount of muscle? You probably don't, because there are plenty of studies showing that the vegan diet can be an efficient equivalent to an omnivorous diet for performance and for enhancing body composition. So I suggest don't worry too much of how much mTOR you trigger with your diet. Strength train hard and eat your protein. Do your calculations. If you miss it at some point, don't worry. One thing that diet should never cause you is stress. So just eat your protein, both sources, or one or the other, strength train hard, and you're gonna be okay. So much about protein. Now, carbohydrates. Why do we need carbohydrates for strength training? So first of all, to fuel performance, and secondly, to enhance recovery. Now, carbohydrates are needed to a degree for strength training. So because strength training can be considered as a short duration, high intensity activity that lasts anywhere from, I would say, 15, 20 seconds, sometimes maybe even 5 or 10 seconds, all the way up to maybe 30 or 40 seconds sometimes. So carbohydrates in the form of glucose do play a crucial role to fuel performance. That's the number one thing, both for muscles, the brain, and the nervous system, all three of them. Recovery, obviously to replenish our muscle glycogen stores, but also to enhance muscle protein synthesis. Because with carbohydrates, we trigger insulin. And insulin is the trigger for the amino acids to be flushed into our muscle cells so we can repair and build our muscles. So that's the two main purposes of carbohydrate intake for strength performance. How much carbohydrates shall I be taking in throughout the day to optimize strength performance? Now, the research suggests 6 grams per kilogram body weight for male strength athletes and possibly less for females. So around 5 to 7 grams. If you weigh 100 kilos as a male athlete, shoot for around 500 grams of carbs per day to optimize strength performance. You can do a bit less as a female. Now, obviously, for someone on the end, of the spectrum of, oh my God, I'm keto, I'm carnivore, how is that meant to be possible? Carbohydrates are definitely important to enhance strength performance and the recovery process. However, there are nuances, like with everything, especially with people that have a weight loss goal, or let's say a body fat loss goal, and they don't tolerate carbohydrates as well. They can obviously go with a more specified advice in that. Now, any advice that we find in the scientific literature, any studies, if we look at the results, probably works for 80% of the population. And then you've got 10% on one end of the spectrum and 10% on the other end. So what we see in science and what we see actually in applicability results is that 80% works, or most of the stuff works for 80% of the population, as is with this advice here. If you don't tolerate that many carbs, you got to keep them lower depending on what your goal is. Here we talk about optimization of strength performance for 80, maybe even a little bit more percent of the population. Now, timing of carbohydrate intake before exercise. There's conflicting evidence, and the conflicting evidence is a result of the disparity of different types of study protocols being executed. Now, one thing or one area where carbs before a workout can have a potential effect is when the workout is of quite high volume and duration. So for example, bodybuilding training, yeah, with high volume, followed by a short HIIT training session. So maybe 1.5 hours. That's when carbohydrates can come in handy before a workout to really fuel performance for the entire workout. Now, talking about strength performance, you don't need to consume carbs before a workout, because you will still have left plenty in the tank, either from the night before or when you train later in the day, from the carbohydrates you've ingested throughout the day. I personally am also not a fan of eating carbs, especially complex carbs, before a workout, because carbs raise insulin, yeah, and we don't want to raise insulin during a workout. We want to raise cortisol, which is the mobilizing hormone, and insulin and cortisol are counterparts. So carbohydrates before a workout, definitely not necessary for strength workouts. Now, between or within the workout, again, there's conflicting evidence, and again, showing that if the workout lasts quite long, or quite a bit longer than 1 hour, and it's of really high intensity, then you may ingest a fast release carbohydrate, maybe like maltodextrin, to fuel performance for the entire workout. Now, after exercise, 1 to 1.2 grams of kilogram body weight immediate after exercise is recommended to really replenish glycogen and to release insulin and improve muscle protein synthesis. Now, this one study by Miller et al. From 2003 showed that nutrient combining is actually even more favorable than a single nutrient intake to enhance muscle protein synthesis. So combining protein and carbs is better than just carbs. Now, when we combine protein and carbs after the workout, it also lowers our carbohydrate requirement. So to replenish glycogen and to enhance muscle protein synthesis, yeah, if we take two approaches that have the same amount of calories, okay, so one approach is 1.2 grams of carbs, and the other approach is 0.8 grams of protein and 0.4 grams of carbs. So both equal the same amount of calories. However, if we have combined nutrient intake, it actually lowers your requirements to eat carbs. So have a portion of protein and carbs after the workout, simply put. So the third main macronutrient, which is fats, this is usually the macronutrient of least concern in the scientific literature and also practically. Now, there is some evidence suggesting there is a relationship between fat intake and testosterone production, because fats are an important pre-stage to produce hormones. However, there are other studies suggesting that testosterone relates a bit more to total calorie intake. Now, the best results you will get to build muscle and to enhance strength is if you're in a caloric surplus. So whether fat, so fat is not the, I would say, only nutrient that is important for testosterone production, but part of your total calorie intake combined with protein and carbohydrates. So if you want to enhance your testosterone production, focus more on calorie intake than actual fats. In terms of a hierarchy of what is most important, total calories, protein, carbs, and then whatever is left kind of are going to be fats. Again, that's for 80% of the population. So for your total calories that you consume per day, the recommendation for strength athletes is around 20 to 35%. That also includes personal preferences. Some people prefer a higher carbohydrate diet, Some people prefer to keep the carbs a little bit lower. So the final category we're looking at, so we've had total calorie intake, and then we've had the 3 macronutrients. Now we're looking at micronutrients for strength performance. Now, this is from my personal observation, from my personal experience, and from anecdotal / empirical evidence. So this is not 100% pulled from hardcore randomized controlled trials. So if we look at micronutrients, if we look at optimal health and optimal performance, now this is a term, first of all, that has never ever been defined. What is optimal health? The scientific literature also is not able to assess and study optimal health because it would have to be defined first. And that's something we can't do. We have to look at this from an individual to individual basis, from person to person. I also believe, to give an example, that someone that is sedentary compared to someone that strength trains 4 times a week and has an active job, I'm pretty sure the requirements of both people are going to be different. So I'm interested in optimizing health and performance, not in average. So let's take someone that strength trains 3 to 5 times a week, has an active kind of job, and needs every single help that he or she can get to optimize health and performance. So I would recommend vitamin C, 2 to 3 grams per day, least not for acetylcholine replenishment. Acetylcholine, as we know, is the nerve signal transmitter. Strength performance relies partly on nerve signal transmission. So if we have enough vitamin C to reproduce acetylcholine, I believe it can have an effect on strength performance. Zinc, 20 to 30 grams per, milligrams per day. Zinc is really important for testosterone production and cellular repair, and also immune function as a little side effect. Zinc is absolutely crucial. Magnesium, twice a day, 400 to 500 milligrams for muscle recovery and relaxation. And also vitamin D, 3,000 to 4,000 international units per day. Vitamin D has shown correlation with strength performance in a couple of scientific studies. Also, vitamin D, as we know, is an important, or let's call it vitamin D3, an important hormone that is paramount to immune function and also to reduce inflammation in the body. So these are micronutrients I recommend to take every single day, just to supplement of what we already get through the diet. That's why supplements are called supplements, because they supplement the biggest chunk that we need to get through our regular diet. Can they make a difference? Possibly. And I say, if you train a few times a week in the gym, if you do strength training, if you have an active lifestyle, why not? Why not? Okay, so a brief summary of this talk. Number 1, we have to determine caloric surplus or maintenance for optimizing strength performance. Maintenance good, surplus even better. Deficit can work in some conditions. Protein intake 1.6 to 2.2 grams per day. Carbohydrate intake 4 to 6 grams per kilogram body weight per day. The fats will be the remaining 20 to 25 or 35% depending on preferences of total calories, and micronutrients in addition to our regular diet. These are basic common recommendations for optimizing nutrient intake to optimize strength performance, that is fueling, recovery, and also adaptation. Now at the end here, you have the references, so you can do your own reading. And I'd like to thank you very much for watching this talk. As always, please feel free or do give me feedback. I'll be really, really happy to hear from you. Thanks very much.